So assume a person has been found guilty, whether they have been found guilty by a jury or they've pled guilty in a plea negotiation. They're now going to be punished. What is the criterion? What is the basis on which we punish them? In a different lecture, we'll have a look at sentencing, but right now we want to focus a little bit on what are the kind of ideas or values behind punishment. What are we trying to achieve by punishment? Traditionally, there have been four main goals of punishment: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. I'm going to add on a fifth, restorative justice. And these are going to help us understand what the point of the punishment is. Retribution, the first goal of punishment that we're going to discuss, has become very much the dominant emphasis of punishment over the last 3 or 4 decades. It hasn't always been the case, but it has been since about the late 1970s. The idea of retribution is that punishment is inflicted on people and is deserved because offenders need to pay their debts to society, because they've harmed victims or harmed society. In other words, it's based on the idea or philosophy that punishment is a moral response to a moral wrong or harm inflicted on society. In that sense, retribution suggests that punishment should be proportionate to harm. The rise of various changes in American society and American politics from the late 70s and into the 80s led to a tremendous renewal or return to the idea of retribution as a justification for punishment. In part, that was because there became an increasing belief that rehabilitation was either something that couldn't be achieved or that shouldn't even be tried to be achieved, because people committed crimes were so awful, they needed the moral antagonism of the community as part of their punishment. One potential side benefit of the emphasis on retribution is the extent that it fed into and related in some ways to another or second philosophy of punishment, the idea of deterrence. Now, if you think back to what we learned about rational choice theories of criminology, we've already been introduced the idea of deterrence, which is the idea that if people are going to commit crime because they think there's a benefit involved, you can deter them, you can persuade them away from crime by increasing the negative consequences of that crime. General deterrence is the idea that we need to punish people or have punishments available in order to discourage crime in the first place. But we know that merely discouraging crime with the threat of punishment works for most of us, but not all of us. That's why crime occurs. So then we get on to the idea of specific deterrence. And specific deterrence says punishment needs to be inflicted in a particular and more harsh way on criminals to discourage them from committing future crimes. So specific deterrence targets the decisions and behavior of offenders who've already been convicted, as opposed to general deterrence, which is supposed to stop the rest of us from getting engaged in criminal behavior in the first place. Now, I hope one of the things you're asking yourself is, does deterrence work? And the simple answer is yes and no, or no and yes. So not simple, in other words. If we look at our rates of recidivism and the fact that most people who are released from prison go back and commit crime again, we'll certainly come to the conclusion that maybe specific deterrence doesn't work. But in fact, it might turn out that that in part has to do with other factors, like the difficulties we create for people who have criminal convictions in re-entering normal and straight life in any normal way. If we look at general deterrence, we know that for the most part, deterrence does work. I tend to not speed when I'm driving on a highway because I don't want to get a ticket. If there wasn't a risk of getting a ticket, I probably would speed. So in that sense, deterrent works. And the only problem with that example is that speeding is seldom a criminal offense, but I use it because most of us can relate to that example. I think most of us would go faster than we're allowed to. if there wasn't the potential of a really expensive ticket, or maybe even some hours or a night or two in jail. So sometimes deterrence works, sometimes it doesn't. But I want to remind you of something else that we mentioned when we talked about rational choice. Research shows that effective deterrence has less to do with the severity of the punishment and more to do with the probability of being caught and punished quite quickly. So it's less severity and more certainty and speed. A third value or practice or ideology of why we punish is incapacitation, which is the idea that we can deprive an offender of the ability to commit crimes, either initially or repeat crimes. Nowadays, one of the ways we do that is with electronic monitoring. People have to wear wrist bracelets or ankle bracelets so that they can be monitored to prevent them going near a place where they might commit crime or from leaving their home, for example. Of course, being put in jail or prison is a pretty powerful incapacitation tool in that it stops you being engaged in society and limits any harm you can do to the immediate environment of the jail. One problem with emphasizing incapacitation as a goal, especially when it comes to imprisonment, is that many people argue the problems with our criminal justice policy have led to widespread warehousing of people in a system of mass imprisonment, which doesn't lead to rehabilitation or doesn't actually solve any of the underlying problems. Selective incapacitation is in part meant to address that goal, insofar as you focus on incapacitation more for repeat offenders. This is much of the logic of 3 strikes and you're out. The idea that if people keep on offending in terms of criminal law, their sentences need to get worse and worse over time, so that they are not just being penalized for their crime, but they are being stopped from committing new crimes by selective incapacitation. Again, that takes us in part into issues of mass incarceration, its expense, and the problems of predicting which offenders are most likely to recidivate. And the problem with that is we just don't know. At least on paper, and sometimes in practice, a very popular practice of punishment, reflecting a goal of punishment, is that punishment should not just be used to show what a person has done wrong, but to try and correct them and give them an opportunity to come right. It's the idea of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation focuses on the offender rather than the crime. And its goal is to restore convicted offenders to constructive social roles, whether it is by educational training or by therapy or drug or alcohol treatment and so on. In other words, the idea of curing the criminal or correcting the criminal, and that's part of where the term corrections as a term for the institutions of punishment in our society comes from. Ironically, the very time the term corrections came to the fore, the practice of corrections or the logic of rehabilitation was going in the opposite direction. And what we see is, although from about the 1940s to the 1970s there was a strong emphasis on rehabilitation, since the 1970s or 1980s, rehabilitation was in decline. It is starting to make a modest resurgence in much, but not all, of the United States, in part because of problems that have emerged from our system of mass incarceration, in part perhaps because of a change in public and political mood. The final kind of punishment or logic of punishment that we're going to talk about comes from a very different point of view. It's called restorative justice. Now, restorative justice shares with other ideas of punishment the idea that crime is a wrong that hurts, and therefore that the offender needs to be punished. However, it doesn't stop there. It also says the community and the victim need to have attention paid to them, and that hurt also reflects something in need of healing and repair. In other words, crime is a wrong that hurts and reflects hurt of the victim above all, but also of the community and the offender. This emphasis on healing and repair does not exclude punishment and control. In fact, many practices of restorative justice have a very strong punitive dimension to them and a control dimension to them. But what they do is say it's not just about the punishment. It should also be about repair for the victim, the community, and the offender. It's a relatively new philosophy in the US criminal justice system, and it's certainly not a majority approach. When it is used, it tends mostly to be used for less serious crimes, like for juvenile crime. And it can be combined with other practices like victim-offender reconciliation or victim-offender conferencing. However, it can also be used in very serious cases, including cases of murder. And occasionally you'll find people who say, I don't want the murderer of my child to get the death penalty. And in fact, I want to get to the point where I might be able to communicate with them, maybe even forgive them. And to do that, we need a restorative justice process. It doesn't mean that the person might not be in prison the rest of their lives. But it does mean that you don't only think of them in prison and sort of throwing out the key. At a national and international level, some countries, including South Africa, have used restorative justice approaches in dealing with mass atrocities, as, for example, the case of South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So while it's not a majority approach, it is an approach that is instructive and helps us rethink some of our basic logics and intentions in why we punish.